It's been 20-plus years and both sides have suffered loss within the culture wars. Talking with those on both sides of the battlefield, cultural diplomacy unites theology and culture in open, peaceful dialogue with the goal of reconstruction instead of destruction. Here are the show's hosts and founders of Ceasefire Strategies, Eric Bumpus and Tim Moranville. Good afternoon. This is your host, Eric Bumpus, and welcome to Cultural Diplomacy.
And I'm your co-host, Tim Moranville.
And today we're talking with documentary filmmaker and screenwriter Brian Godawa. Godawa is the screenwriter for the award-winning feature film To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland. It's been awarded the Best Picture of the Heartland Film Festival, the Commander-in-Chief Medal of Service, Honor and Pride by the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and showcased at the 2003 Cannes Film Festival Cinema for Peace. And today we're going to be talking with him about the importance of documentaries and why they are needed. Brian is currently working on 3 different documentaries. The first one is Wall of Separation, which has been out and has been shown on PBS, and that is about the wall of separation between a church and state. The second documentary we'll be talking about later on this afternoon is Lines That Divide, the Great Stem Cell Debate, and the third one is entitled Schools Out, Political Correctness versus Academic Freedom. So we want to go ahead and welcome Brian to our show. How are you doing this afternoon?
Good, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So as I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about documentaries today, kind of why they're important and why Christians should be involved and how they should kind of look at documentaries, and then we want to get a little bit more in depth into each of the documentaries that you are currently working on. Wanted to start with documentaries are really gaining a lot of popularity in the mainstream today, as well as persuasive films, such as the films of Michael Moore, Morgan Spurlock, and recently with Bill Maher's new, if you want to call it a documentary, Religulous. This purveying popularity of documentaries is going on in our culture. Now seems to be about the right time for documentaries.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting time we live in because of the nature of the new media and availability of cameras and such for the common man. You see a lot of this stuff going on the internet, actually, where people are making their own documentaries and their own films. But this is the era of docu-ganda, is what I would call it. There's a couple of things to think about when we're talking about documentaries. First off is the illusion of objectivity that much of the past was driven on, meaning that news reporters, journalists, filmmakers, documentary filmmakers are these objective people or neutral people who are trying to get at the facts and discover and listen to both sides and post both sides up in a film to let the viewer decide. This was an illusion even when they were actually promoting that. You've heard the claims, you decide and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's an illusion because there's really no such thing as an objective neutral viewpoint, and particularly in filmmaking. Now, and I think that in one level we've gotten to the point where we're starting to realize this and appreciate that. But on another level, there's still a vast, maybe there's either a vast ignorance of that or a manipulation of that truth. But nowadays, there's a total jettisoning of any attempt to be fair. And unfortunately, I think many documentaries, particularly the ones that go on feature films, that many of them have become propaganda pieces. They shouldn't call them documentaries. I mean, Morgan Spurlock, obviously Michael Moore. The fact that they're still, and Religulous with Bill Maher, the fact that they're calling it documentaries is laughable. They're not documentaries. They're commentary pieces or they're propaganda pieces, but they're not documentaries. Because and the way even when you go on PBS, which we got our Wall of Separation on PBS, we had to try to make sure we were as fair as we possibly could and not say sort of like try to show both sides. But at the end of the day, every decision of every single edit in every single film is made by a mind from a perspective, and it's gonna be in line with one particular worldview or not. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be fair. To the opposing viewpoint, doesn't mean you can't give the other side some voice, to try to because you want people to know as much facts and knowledge as you can, even though you're going to have a viewpoint. So there's somewhere in between those extremes of we're totally objective news reporting, which is a lie, and Michael Moore, which is the other lie. is, okay, we've got a viewpoint, but we're going to try to be fair. We're going to try to speak persuasively to people who may not agree with us. So we're going to try to keep the rhetoric down, try to, that kind of thing. So, and that's kind of where I find myself in the middle of, is unfortunately nowadays, in order to get a feature film, which is one that goes into theaters rather than straight to TV, it almost has to be a high concept, big idea, like a movie, like a motion picture. Because people don't, when they go to the theaters, they don't tend to want to go see documentaries, really. There are some shocking, things that occur, like what was the Penguin one with Morgan Freeman?
March of the Penguins.
It's a shocker that was such a hit. It was such a hit. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful little piece and stuff. But you rarely can tell when those are going to be hits. But so you've got to tend to have something sensationalistic if you're going to make a feature film that is a, quote, documentary or a documenta piece. Thus, if you have something like Michael Moore where, George Bush is trying to take over the country into a fascist empire, or, the gun nuts in the world are trying to, get rid of our rights, all these goofy things, or Morgan Spurlock where, I think it certainly wasn't a false idea that he was communicating, but it's definitely sensationalistic. Eat McDonald's food for 30 days, and you gain 40 pounds, and you get near death. I mean, that's sensationalistic, and it's good. It's a great, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely not a documentary. So we're in this era of postmodern negation of truth where they don't really care about the truth just if it's a good story. Therefore, people are willing to lie and manipulate, like a la Michael Moore, in order to make the story better. And that's the danger that we're living in, because many people don't believe in absolute truth anymore. So when a culture starts to get rid of the belief in absolute truth, well, then they're going to start lying more, because there is no absolute truth. So why should they tell the truth? Why not lie in order to prove your point and win your argument? And so it's almost a prophecy of the postmoderns that sort of say, hey, there's no truth. Everyone's prejudiced and biased, and therefore it's just a fight for power. And because they believe that way, then they act that way. And so that's the danger we live in. So in the meantime, I'm trying to navigate those waters with the recognition that there's no neutral viewpoint, but nonetheless, can you communicate truth and facts as honest as you can, as fair as you can, and yet still come to a conclusion in the course of your work. Now, I can say that on my first documentary, Wall of Separation, that actually happened, where I actually started with sort of a particular viewpoint, and as I did the research, I kind of came into a different view. I adjusted my viewpoint as I did the documentary. So to a certain degree, that documentary, which chronicled the understanding of the concept of separation of church and state in America, it was sort of a historical piece about what has America, what is the idea of separation of church and state? Where did it start? It began with Thomas Jefferson's letter, in 1800, and what did they think of it back then? How did the founding fathers think of church-state relations? And then through history, we looked at Supreme Court decisions and showed how the culture has come to see this concept that's not actually in the Constitution, but it is definitely a organizing framework from which we interpret the Constitution. And so our attempt was sort of do Ken Burns' sort of historical piece. And in the course of that, I actually softened my viewpoint. I changed my view somewhat because I discovered facts that altered me. So I'm kind of proud of that piece in that, it got, like I said, it got on PBS, and it was a fair approach to the problem and the issue that I think is very confusing to a lot of Americans. But it nonetheless did have a viewpoint, So that was the first one. And then recently, the other two documentaries that you mentioned, I'm working on right now. I'm trying to finish up. One of them is on embryonic stem cell research, which is a very controversial topic, of course. And it deals with, of course, the pro-life issue because of the fact that you're taking human embryos in order to engage in research. And so the pro-lifers are out, and they're, trying to deal with it. And then there's the pro-choicers who believe that, embryonic, human embryos are not human life, and so we can save millions of human lives if we just, get the federal funding and get people behind this. And then you've got a lot of people in the middle who are respectful of human life. Maybe they're pro-life, but they still think, but in this situation, embryonic stem cell research is acceptable because of the guidelines that they operate behind. So there's a wide berth of viewpoints. Well, we wanted to go out there and find out what the issues were. And honestly, I didn't know what the issues were. I had my own opinion based on my own knowledge what I had. But we went and interviewed a bunch of people, a bunch of scholars, a bunch of, not scholars, I mean like medical doctors and ethicists and such. And so there's a certain degree where you start to make a documentary. You can only begin with what you know, and so you go down that path. But then as you do go down that path, you start to discover yourself. And that discovery process, hopefully, is what you can capture in the documentary and you know, like I said, deal with people who might disagree or might be in the middle and try to provide enough honest portrayal of facts and the truth, as well as your viewpoint, in order to communicate what's out there today. So our goal with, by the way, the documentary is called Lines That Divide, the Great Stem Cell Debate. Right now we're trying to get a celebrity narrator in order to narrate it, so we're not quite finished yet. But that's what that one is. And I just want to say one other thing about the wall separation. Wall separation was on PBS, but we had to do a slight modification on it for it's going to be distributed through these Christian film distributors. So it's now another version of it called Faith of Our Fathers. And that will be distributed soon through some Christian distributors. So if you're interested, look for Faith of Our Fathers. Otherwise, there might still be a few copies of Wall Separation available for purchase at the following URL, wallofseparation.net.
Why don't we go ahead then and talk about the importance of documentaries to our society? Obviously, it serves a different purpose than storytelling. But it is storytelling nonetheless. What is the importance of the documentary film?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And in some ways, I kind of feel like I'm in the discovery of it myself because, quite frankly, I am a feature film writer and director. These documentaries just happen to come along one after another, 3 in a row. So while I enjoy doing them, that's not my primary focus. And so I feel like in some ways I'm discovering documentaries as well as I'm doing them. And I think that the importance of them is, there's a couple of things. And one is that they communicate information to a public that no longer reads.
Right.
You know, you're not going to read about Thomas Jefferson. You're not going to read about history and politics because Americans don't tend to like that. But you can embody a book into a documentary, and you have to simplify things more. So the act of making a documentary, whether it's an hour or even a 2-hour documentary, if you're doing this kind of documentary, of course, there's different kinds of documentaries, but if you're doing a sort of a historical piece like Wall Separation, the benefit of it is you hone down what's the most important highlights or bullet points, because that's all you have for an hour or 2 hours, right? And that act of honing it down to those important highlights, which, again, whatever worldview you have determines what are the more important points, see? So you can't get away from that. But nonetheless, you do that, and it simplifies it for people who can digest an hour video but wouldn't sit down to read a book for 5, 6, 7 hours that it takes to read a book on Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation. So there's that benefit, I think, and so people are more willing to listen to that kind of information. And also because it is more interesting and there's more power behind the visual image. You know, when you see pictures of Thomas Jefferson, when you see pictures of whatever, the original Congress or the original letter that he wrote or whatever, you see these pictures and images and of the Supreme Court as they make their decisions through history, blah, blah, blah. There's a certain, I think, value to seeing the visual image worked out that just mere words do not accomplish. And it's almost, I don't know if I could put it into words, to be honest with you, but I think there's power to that. Now, some people would say, oh, but that's more manipulative, words are better, books are better, videos manipulate, images manipulate, and that can be true. They do often manipulate, but the problem is so do books. So, you've got just as many books out there on separation of church and state that are just as manipulative with words as there are documentaries. So there's really in my mind, there's disadvantages, but there's also advantages of both sides, whether you read a book or watch the documentary. I do tend to prefer reading books because you do get more information, and oftentimes book authors are guided by certain structural needs in the way they write their books, but they don't have to force their information or force their facts into a paradigm as much as a documentary. Because a documentary, you've got to find a story in it, or people aren't going to be in. If you just spew out a bunch of facts, it's going to be boring. So you've got to find a, quote, story in the facts. And that story guides you, the narrative guides you to bring them, just like watching a feature film, only, it's obviously slightly different. But what I'm saying is there's a sense of narrative and story even to a documentary in order to keep people's attention. So that can both bias or, give meaning to, because let's face it, the way we interpret reality is through story anyway. And so if we look at the facts out in the real world, the way that we try to make sense of it is we see all these crazy things happening or good things happening or whatever. We see things happen in the real world. And then we go, well, what does this mean, and how does it relate to my life, and how does it relate to reality and truth and all that? Well, we have a grid, we have a worldview, we have a narrative of how we interpret the world. And that worldview narrative is we take all the so-called facts that we see and we place them within our story that's in our brain about how we're seeing reality. And then that's sort of how we interpret the world anyway. So the act of a documentary finding a story and telling it is just the way that our brains work normally anyway, and that's the way that we understand truth. So if that's making any sense, I think that's sort of one of the processes of making documentaries, is finding the story and giving it some structure so that it's not just a bunch of stuff that's thrown at you.
Well, in kind of summarizing that then, for those Christians who are creating a documentary, and I realize these principles aren't necessarily specific to Christians, they apply to everyone, but in finding a narrative, we are adhering to fairness, we are wanting to communicate truth, and we start with what we know.
Right.
To flip that a little bit to the viewers of documentary, if a Christian is to view a documentary, what are some principles that they should keep in mind on how to view a documentary from a Christian point of view? For example, if they're watching Religious, which is not a Christian viewpoint or worldview.
Yeah, Religious, again, it's not a documentary, that's just a hate piece. So do you want to go to a Ku Klux Klan rally? No, I don't think we should go to Ku Klux Klan rallies, and I don't think we should go to hate movies like Religious. But if there's a documentary, like there's been documentaries on television about who's the real Jesus with Peter Jennings, right? From Jesus to the Christ. Oh, these guys are going to have interview scholars and tell us, oh, this is what Jesus was really like, and this is how we've misinterpreted him. Well, when you're going to sit down, now that's more of an attempt to be a documentary, so that's a little bit fairer of an issue. So when you sit down, you have to keep in mind a couple things. One is you're watching something that's purporting to communicate facts, but all facts are interpreted through a worldview, and so the filmmakers, no matter how objective they may claim to be, they're going to be communicating a certain view about the world and interpreting everything through it, stilted or not, through that worldview. So as you're watching, you have to be figuring out what is their view of the world, and discernment takes practice. That means you have to educate yourself on the different worldviews and the way people see the world. You have to educate yourself and get good at being able to figure out what people are trying to say, and that's something that's sort of separate from the viewing experience. It's sort of, you need to be more intelligent about the way you're living your Christian life. So if you do that, you're watching a documentary and you're saying, okay, what's the person's viewpoint? What's the point they're trying to make? And as you're watching it, be looking for not just facts, but how the facts are presented, right? And I don't mean this like you're supposed to come at a documentary from an entirely hostile perspective or defensive posture. But honestly, in this day and age, in a secular day and age where there are very few documentaries that I watch that are not biased through the secular, humanistic, atheistic world viewpoint. So I don't mean to be to sort of think that everything's against us, but the fact is a lot of it is. So you just have to, it's sort of like being in the black in the Jim Crow era. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of white people who don't hate us, but let's face it, a lot of people in power do, and it's not wrong to acknowledge that. So you're watching it, try to be aware of how they might be biased, how they might be selecting certain information and not saying other things? You know, do they in a court? You know, if there's a documentary and there's something about a crime or something, do they only interview one person and not the other person? You know, that kind of thing. Do they present fairly the opposing viewpoint? Now, oftentimes you're going to be one of the viewpoints, so you could tell if they're presenting your viewpoint on there and they're presenting it unfairly. Then you can see that. It'll be obvious. Like you'll know Christians don't think that way. They're presenting Christians as if they're this way or that, and like in Bill Maher's movie or something, But or even in a documentary, when they're talking about Christianity and from a secular viewpoint, if you've read your history and know a little bit about Christian church, you can tell where they're stilting the facts, So you just have to be careful, be discerning, look for the worldview, look for their bias, see what they're showing and what they're choosing not to show. Because what you choose not to show is just as illuminating as what you choose to show. So like if they interview one side of the equation, then that, and not the other side, then you see, okay, they're leaving something out, which means they're not telling the full picture. Another thing is to understand some basics about persuasion. If you're dealing with a controversial issue, well, just in general, rhetorically speaking, whoever has the last word tends to have the most power because they're the last thing heard, right? So that tends to have more influence than being the first thing heard. Well, to be the first thing heard and the last thing heard are both positions of authority in terms of rhetoric. So if however they're ending, like if they show one side then another side, one side then another side, if you're ending on one side all the time, then you can tell that's their viewpoint, see? So, and that's not necessarily manipulative or evil or anything like that. It's just the way we as humans operate to persuade. It helps to persuade our viewpoint. So be looking for that bias and the perspective through those various things, and that will help you to be able to discern the good from the bad, because I think most movies, including most documentaries, are a mixture of good and bad, and they're not all bad, and they're never all good, so it's all about trying to discern. And then, of course, if you're inspired, if you're interested in the subject, read some other materials on it,
Excellent.
Well, we're going to go ahead and take a break real quick. We're talking with Brian Godawa today about the importance of documentaries and why they are needed, and we'll be right back to discuss his first documentary, Wall of Separation.
Are you just watching?
Do you enjoy watching movies? The cool effects, the interesting characters, the explosions.
Yeah, you like the explosions, admit it.
Well, we do too.
But sometimes it pays to approach Hollywood media with a healthy dose of critical thinking.
Join me, Daniel Lewis,
and Eve Franklin,
as we discuss our favorite movies
and share critical thinking for the entertained Christian.
So visit areyoujustwatching.com to subscribe.
And don't just watch.
Welcome back to Cultural Diplomacy. We're talking with Brian Godawa this week, and we're going to now discuss his documentary, Wall of Separation, which has aired on PBS. Wall of Separation is a metaphor deeply embedded in the American consciousness and an idea that continues to cause deep controversy within the country. In this historical documentary, Godawa takes a look at what the Founding Fathers intended when they framed the Constitution and wrote the First Amendment Religion Clause. Were they trying to create a Christian nation, a secular paradise, or something in between? An examination of the humble origins of the Wall of Separation in Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists reveals a meaning quite different from the modern understanding, yet one that foreshadowed the ongoing debate of today. The documentary takes a look at how our understanding of church and state relations has changed through history by means of Supreme Court decisions and cultural pressures. From Everson versus Board of Education to the most recent decisions over Ten Commandments displays, such interpretations are explored in comparison with the Founders' original intent. This raises questions. Should original intent guide modern interpretation? Should government be secular, or should religion have influence on the state? There are no easy answers to this ongoing debate that polarizes the nation. So, Brian, tell us a little bit more, in depth, what was the starting point for the documentary? You mentioned a little earlier that you went into it with one viewpoint, and by the end you changed yours.
Yeah, well, it was basically funded. Someone wanted to do a documentary on this, and they had the money, so they hired us. And I started doing my research, and we started doing the interviews. And basically, what it was that, I like many other people, I grew up with this concept separation of church and state, it's like embedded in our consciousness, and this idea is, of course, separation of church and state, because you don't want the church being meddling in government affairs, because that will create theocracy, or that will be like these Muslim nations, or what, what I'm saying, and sort of had that view that of course keep religion out of government because that's detrimental. And yet, coming to find, as I look into it and realizing the Founding Fathers' original intent in the Constitution, and understanding the First Amendment and what the religious clauses meant, was something that I was not very educated on. In fact, most Americans are simply not educated on it at all. And that the origin of that phrase actually came from Thomas Jefferson, who was not around when the Constitution was actually ratified, and so he was in France at the time, And it was his particular interpretation in a particular situation. And there's even scholarship that actually makes a point that even Jefferson's use of the phrase is not he did not use it in the way that we think of it today. And here's basically what it was that the First Amendment and the religious clauses, you should have no establishment of religion and free exercise. Those are two clauses that, of course, free exercise to us means we can do and say anything we want, and that's really not the context of what they meant. But also, the no establishment clause is the clause that we've all assumed throughout all these years. It means that if anything religious gets involved in government, then that's establishing religion. That has nothing to do with the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause, turns out, was that, of course, when they came over to this country and founded the country, it was to get away from, there was a state church of the King of England, and among other political issues, they wanted religious freedom because you had to belong to the one church of England if you were an English citizen. And so in America, people wanted to congregate around their own beliefs. They had different beliefs and such. And so when they wanted no establishment, what they meant was that the federal government, the federal government, not local state governments, should not impose a particular religious denomination of Christianity. Because they were all Christians at that time, mostly, or deists, but they operated within the Christian worldview. And when they meant religion, they meant Christianity. And so what they wanted was, they didn't want the whole federal government to become like the King of England, where you have to have a certain denomination or certain belief system. But at the same time that they promoted that, they also fully engaged in their own religious beliefs. Presidents gave prayers, gave prayer proclamations, even Jefferson did. They invoked God all the time, So in other words, as personal people involved in the government, they always applied their religious beliefs to government. They always did. The belief is that individual states have specific rights. They have all the rights for everything that's not stipulated in the Constitution. The Constitution has nothing to do with the states. It has to do with the congregation of the states or the federal government. The Constitution delineates powers for the federal government alone, and it says no powers can be given to the government that are not listed in here, the federal government. Those are reserved for the states. So the balance was that the states were more localized congregations, and if you didn't like that state, you could move to another one that was more to your liking. So they had established state religions, but they didn't want established federal religion. So there really is no concept of state rights anymore, and that's one of the heart of the issues. The point being that the Founding Fathers were integrationists. That is, they did not want to force people into their religious views, but they integrated their own personal religious views into their voting, into their laws, into everything they said and did. They just didn't impose it onto others. And so therefore, hey, if you were Baptist or you were Presbyterian or whatever, you would still talk about God, but they wouldn't want the country to become a Baptist country or a Presbyterian country. Nowadays, what separation of church and state has come to mean through all the various interpretations in the courts is, if anyone has any religious belief, they can't be involved in the government, or if they are, their religion can't inform anything they do. So if you find out that this person believes in God, and so he's getting his idea to have low taxes based on his belief, that's wrong. But that's not at all what the Founding Fathers intended. And basically, separation of church and state it was originally meant to protect the church from the state. meaning they didn't want the state to be able to control all the individual people and churches. But now what it's come to mean is it protects the state from the church, which has been turned around so that it becomes a weapon against religion and used to keep religious beliefs from affecting the culture, whereas atheist beliefs can have all the power they want to affect culture. You can be atheist and have atheistic laws and all that. But so it's a strange sort of thing that's occurred over history through Supreme Court decisions. A lot of it has been because we go to the Supreme Court for our interpretation and such. And it's changed. It started out one way and it's changed over years to what it's become today. And it's, to me, the goal was, everything I've just said to you was sort of like my personal conclusions of what I've learned from it. But what we tried to do in the documentary is just sort of tell the story and quote the sources and let people see what I've just concluded myself. So in other words, we tried to be true to the facts. We tried, like I said, there's a viewpoint. I definitely choose certain things that are important, but I try to show both sides. But, there's definitely a viewpoint there. But nonetheless, we try to quote the Supreme Court decisions, quote the authors, quote the Founding Fathers, show what they said, show what they did, to let them speak for themselves as much as possible. And hopefully people will see this interesting historical progression. Now, we don't say, it could be, it often is automatically assumed in, you want us to turn back the clock and go, and start a theocracy and be like the Founding Fathers. And I'm not necessarily saying that in the documentary. In fact, I try to make sure that I just showed what happened. I'm not saying we should go back to the Founding Fathers. I'm just saying this is how they thought, and it's changed, and now this is how we think. So it's not a polemical argument about how everything's gone wrong, we need to go back. That's for the opinion of the viewers to conclude for themselves. I just want to find out, what did the Founding Fathers think, and then what do we think now? So I don't know if that makes sense. But
that actually touches greatly on one of the questions in your summary. Should original intent guide modern interpretation? I've talked with a couple friends of mine recently about how one party tends to look at the Constitution as a very concrete document, law of the land, we must adhere to it, the letter of the law, and then the other party, there's more about the spirit of the law, that it's a very fluid document, that we should have the right and ability to change it. With our Founding Fathers, do you think they intended for the Constitution to be added to and changed and updated, or were they looking at that to be something that would remain true from there until eternity?
Yes, the two views are living document versus original intent, and I'm actually somewhere in between, and I think even most original intent people are somewhere in between, because what that means is, obviously you can't, they were more agricultural, we're more industrial, and whatever, there's all kinds of things that have taken place that intent has to do with the original intent and purpose behind it. Rather than taking words and making them mean something that they don't mean, you should change the Constitution, because the living document perspective is the belief that truth and language is relative, and that's what's really dangerous. Now, I come more in that middle towards the original intent side, but I don't try to say, in this documentary, I don't make an argument for that. I just simply show what the original intent was and what our intent is now, if that makes sense. So there is how you're going to interpret those facts. I've had many people watch the documentary and say, well, yeah, okay, I'll buy that, but I don't want to go back to what they intended because I don't agree with their original intent. And that's fine. I would say, however, though, that if that's what you believe, then you need to change the Constitution rather than just changing what it means, because what happens when you just change words and make them what you mean, you set yourself up for fascism and dictatorship, because whoever's in power defines what things mean, and they're no longer obliged or they're no longer under the authority of anything and it's interesting because this is exactly what Jefferson and Adams were worried about, and Hamilton. They basically said, beware of the judicial branch, because the very first court case that actually happened, Marbury versus Madison, is very interesting. The very first court case was all about the authority of the Supreme Court's decisions. Did they have the decision? Is their decision to decry something, claim something non-constitutional? How far does it extend? Because what the Founding Fathers were worried about, they actually said, beware of a judicial branch because eventually they will be legislating law from the bench. They will eventually become the supreme lawmakers merely through interpretation. That's what they were originally worried about, which is why they originally made the Supreme Court the weakest branch, and they tried, and it was unimportant to them. They didn't have its own building. They just had they housed it in some basement of one of the federal buildings because they didn't want it to become an important branch. But now, of course, look what it's become. It's become they legislate from the bench, and they determine laws. So Congress can pass a law, and if the Supreme Court doesn't like it, they just say, it's not constitutional. Whether or not it has anything to do with the Constitution is irrelevant. They just say it's not constitutional, and then it's no longer valid. So they have the ultimate authority and supreme, and that's a real danger. None of that is in my documentary, of course, but because I don't address the application of it. I just address what's the facts surrounding the interpretation.
Do you happen to cover the Everson versus Board of Education debate? Yeah,
just very briefly, in the course of things. And the separation of church and state has kind of been a concept that's come and gone, but there are hallmarks where it makes a punch hole in culture, and that was one of them because that was where Justice Hugo Black made that famous pronouncement, where he referred back to the wall of separation. And his interpretation in that was that religion should have absolutely should have nothing to do whatsoever with anything related to government. In other words, and other justices in other cases had said, what this basically does is establish secularism as a religious state, And so secularism operates and functions very much like a religion. So when you try to keep religion out of government, then what you're doing is establishing a secular religious state, which is a violation of the Constitution. So it's interesting because the whole point here is separation of church and state, what it originally meant was not the separation of religion from government. What it was an establishment of two spheres of authority, the church and the state. Church, state. Religion, government is a different concept. Church and state are institutions, and they have separate spheres of authority, and those spheres of authority are circumscribed by constitutional law. But religion, integration of religion and government is different because what that means is that people's religious views inform their decisions and their laws. And there's nothing wrong with that because you still have to vote on laws. You still have to, you still have to get majorities. You still have to do all that. But nonetheless, all the original founders had religious beliefs that they integrated into their government, but they just didn't try to establish a church. Church is the institution. Religion is the beliefs. So that's another fine distinction that modern-day people, they just make church church and state is the same thing as religion and government, and it isn't. And if that makes any sense, that's another part of the confusion is that the founders didn't want a state church, meaning people have to become converts and go to this church. Nowadays, what they mean is you can't have religious beliefs affect what you do. That's totally different.
Yeah.
Totally alien to that. Now, there are people who say, well, tough. I mean, I don't think the Founding Fathers were right. In fact, I think the more honest secularists will say that, and I actually respect them far more than these extremists like Barry Lynn and such who attempt to try to say, oh, no, the Founding Fathers didn't want religion to have anything to do with government. I think that they're dishonest. I think it's far more honest to just say, no, look, they integrated their religion too much, and we need to get away from that. That's more honest. And I can respect that viewpoint because that's fair. And quite frankly, I don't think that we should apply everything in the way that they did. We have a different world today, and we got to struggle through these issues. Even my own personal beliefs, I wouldn't want to say that we should go back to the Founding Fathers exactly. I would want to say, what's their intent and general principles, and then how do we apply those principles in new contexts and situations? And that's really what the original intent vision is. It's not to say we wouldn't, like a piece of wood, we slap the Constitution against things. No, it's finding out the principles of what they meant by the concepts and applying them in new situations while maintaining fidelity to those original concepts. Now, if you then believe that those concepts are no longer there, or good, then you change them in the Constitution. But the whole point is there is no separation of church and state in the Constitution at all.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no establishment and free exercise, period. And that's the biggest misunderstanding most people have. They think that, literally, they think separation of church and state is in the Constitution, and it's not. It's in a letter by Thomas Jefferson. So it's his interpretation, you know. And even then, Jefferson meant it in that Founding Father sense. I would argue that he probably was more towards the secular view than the Founding Fathers, but even at that time, he's, you know, supported state churches that for individual states, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So he was arguing with Danbury Baptists of a particular state, and they, you know, he was still reinforcing the Federalist interest in not having a church state imposed, but that doesn't mean he was against state-established churches. So, you know, there's fine points in there that we miss, and to our detriment, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're talking with Brian Godawa here today about a documentary entitled Wall of Separation, soon to also be searched and discovered as Faith of Our Fathers. You can find out more information about this documentary at wallofseparation.net. We'll be back with Brian to talk about another one of his documentaries, Lines That Divide, The Great Stem Cell Debate. We'll be right back after this.
Are you just watching?
Do you enjoy watching movies? The cool effects, the interesting characters, the explosions.
Yeah, you like the explosions, admit it.
Well, we do too.
But sometimes it pays to approach Hollywood media with a healthy dose of critical thinking.
Join me, Daniel Lewis,
And Eve Franklin.
as we discuss our favorite movies.
And share critical thinking for the entertained Christian.
So visit areyoujustwatching.com to subscribe.
And don't just watch.
We're back talking with Brian Godawa about his new documentary, Lines That Divide, The Great Stem Cell Debate. The basic premise is, on the subject of stem cell research, is a potential miracle cure for diseases or a form of biological colonialism. The debate still rages over this controversial science. Supporters argue that it is our moral duty to pursue scientific progress that provides healing hope for humanity. Detractors argue that the ends don't justify the means in harvesting some human life to save others. This documentary seeks to educate the public on the scientific basics of stem cell research and the moral issues surrounding it as we enter the 21st century. So why don't you go ahead and give us maybe some of the background on stem cells for those of us who may not be as informed.
Sure. And I wasn't as much either when I first started this, so it was a fascinating exploration. You know, I think a lot of us are scientifically uninformed about what's really going on with this, and I think it's important for us to become informed because there are serious moral issues related to it. But essentially, what we have here is we have a science that's growing by leaps and bounds in terms of being able to discover a form of medical treatment that may not be the panacea for everything in the world, right? That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
It is a potential source of healing for multitudes of major diseases because what a stem cell is essentially you know, we have different kinds of cells in our bodies, right? We have a bunch of, 100 different kinds of cells in our body. And stem cells are a particularly unique type of cell that's real rare. And what they are is they're so, how can I put it, maybe primordial or basic. The cells are so basic that they can transform into any other kind of cell. And what they do is, like, when there's problems in the body, or, you know, whether it's maybe a bacteria or a wound or something like that. What stem cells often do is they attach themselves to whatever the malady is or the problem in the body is, and they turn into the kind of cell that's needed. It's part of the process of healing, you know, the healing process. And so stem cells can convert into any other kind of cell. So, like, if you've got a kidney problem or something, then stem cells work at trying to regenerate those kidney cells. But the human body doesn't, you know, they're rare. Those are rare, so the healing process doesn't always happen, and when it does, it happens slow, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. So what scientists have discovered is if they can get a bunch of these stem cells together and basically inject them into those problem areas, the virtual mass of those stem cells becomes an overwhelming army of transformation on cellular tissue that's diseased, and it heals. I mean, it just heals, Now, so you've got like heart disease and people with heart disease, then half their heart is dead, and they can get stem cells and put them into the heart, and it regenerates itself because the natural cell propensity is to regenerate. However, it's obviously limited. The body has limitations to how much it regenerates. So if you can pack a bunch of them together and inject them, then through a couple times, it's like overwhelming that tissue with these healing ambulances. They're like little ambulances, right? So, but here's the problem: they're very rare in the human body, and the scientists found out that human embryos, in other words, fertilized human embryos, these are embryos that they got from IVF clinics. When people go to get IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, that's like when a couple is having problems having a baby, they do in vitro. They fertilize a bunch of eggs with the sperm and have them in test tubes waiting, and then they try to implant them. And there's always leftover embryos. And these are embryos that are human. They're human life, okay? And but they're not going to have any more babies, so they give them over to science. So scientists have discovered that these human embryos are loaded with these embryonic stem cells. And the reason why they're very potent is embryonic stem cells can turn into any tissue in the body. Well, which makes sense, right? Because an embryo is going to be something that's going to turn into a human, and it's very, very basic and primordial, right? Now, the stem cells that are already in our bodies, those can turn into some cells but not others. So they're more limited. Okay, so when scientists discovered that, they figured, well, if we could, break apart all these embryos and grow stem cell lines, we could grow millions and millions of this stuff, and we can have access to stem cells to inject into people to heal them, right? Problem is, pro-lifers have pointed out that those are live human embryos, which means we're back to the same basic pro-life argument from the very beginning. That is, human life scientifically begins at conception, period. Like Al Gore said, the argument's over. There's no scientific argument. Human life begins at conception, period. Genetically, it's human life. However, does that mean it's sacred? No. Pro-lifers then say all human life is sacred from conception. Those who believe in pro-choice say, no, it's only when the woman determines it to be so in her body, right? Well, now that they can take all these embryos and kill them at the embryo stage, pro-lifers are saying you're killing massive amounts of human beings just as if you aborted them. And the pro-choicers, or those who are just in favor of the embryonic stem cell research, are saying, no, it doesn't really become a human person until about 14 days when the spine, the central nervous system starts to form, because then that's consciousness. Consciousness can have pain, therefore it's a person. So as long as we destroy the embryo up to the 14th day, we're okay. That's where the moral debate focuses.
Well, I had heard a lecture of a biology professor of a Christian university who kind of took that 14 days and brought it back even closer to conception, but he was putting it at about 36 to 48 hours out with what is titled the second somatic transfer, and that he believed that was about the first time in which the stem cell actually becomes a unique cell, such as a liver cell or a kidney cell, that it doesn't stop being that stem cell until about that second somatic transfer, which is about 36 to 48 hours in. So to me that was interesting, that's putting it's not putting it at conception, but it's not putting it quite out at 14 days. So maybe we have more theories out there than just those
definitely.
two?
Yeah, there definitely is. And quite frankly, and to be honest, that is the area, that's a difficult area. It's not as black and white as everyone would like it to be, but that's the area of debate that's going on with the morality of it, why people are against embryonic stem cell. And the problem is you always come up with the two sides. One is the instrumental use of human life. Look at all the good we can do. You're stopping us from doing good by stopping embryonic stem cell research. And the people are saying, but wait a minute, you're doing evil to do good, so you're killing human beings to help save our human beings. So both sides have strong arguments, but that's not the shocker. See, that's not the shocker that I discovered. That's just the scientific facts that I discovered. The shocker is the massive misinformation campaign that is going on supporting embryonic stem cell research. I'll just mention two main points. One is the entire, virtual, not totally, but comparatively speaking, virtual invisibility of adult stem cell research that is being ignored in comparison with that, and I'll say what that is in a second. And then secondly is there's a massive manipulation in the media and in lawmakers and all the pro-cloning forces and pro-embryonic forces in terms of trying to get laws passed. They are actually redefining cloning and embryonic stem cells so that it doesn't sound like it's human embryos. Basically, they're denying that it's live human embryos, and they're basically using things like it's just a bunch of cells. It hasn't become a human yet. It's not human life. Celebrities like Christopher Reeve, even and scientists. We have doctors on our documentary saying, doctors and scientists saying it's not human life, which genetically it is human life, and that's the point. It's like they're actually being Dark Ages, backward, anti-scientific when they say it's not human life. If they want to say it's human life, but it's not a person and therefore it's okay, that's one thing. But when they're denying that it's human life, then they're actually lying because it scientifically is. Now, and they're doing this in all the legislation they're passing around the country, including Prop 71 in California, which was $3 billion earmarked for embryonic stem cell research, blah, blah, blah. They denied that they were making human life. They denied that the somatic cell nuclear transfer, which is cloning, they denied that it was creating a human being or a human embryo, and they were saying that it basically just creates cells. So they're basically tricking people who don't know better to just say, oh, well, it's not human life, so I'm pro-life, and it's just human cells, so it's okay. And it's a vast lying machine. I mean, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy literally, but it's definitely a consensus of deception because I've got documented cases all over the place. So that's the first one is just the way that they're defining cloning, which is a whole other issue too, but as well as embryonic stem cell research, they're not saying what it really is. Therefore, they're trying to avoid the moral debate. And I have no problem if you want to argue the moral debate and say, no, it's not. Yeah, it's human life, but it's not a person, therefore we can kill it. That's fine. That's fair. That's a fair argument, actually. But it's not a fair argument to say that it's not human life at all. It's just cells. That's not only is that ignorant, it's anti-scientific. So that's the big first one. And the big second one was, what I was shocked to discover was, of course, we don't know, and that's why I didn't know about it until you do deep research, that adult stem cell research is another form of stem cell research that's going on that is very similar to embryonic, but it does not have the moral issue attached to destroying human life, and it is vastly more successful than embryonic, and hardly anybody knows about it. Sure, there are occasional stories that come up, but one of the reasons why is whenever people are talking about stem cell research, they're not differentiating between the two, so it sounds like stem cell research is awesome. Well, the problem is the only successes that have occurred have been adult stem cell, which is this. They go into your body, take your own stem cells out of your own body, they pull a bunch of them out, multiply them and clean them up, and inject them back into you. That's all it is. And that form of and those stem cells then do the same thing in terms of healing the body, and people have been healed of Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. I have testimonies of people being healed from all kinds of these diseases, diabetes and stuff. Now, it's not been, how shall I put it? It's not getting the coverage, and they're not able to do the clinical trials because they're being hampered. But there's many, many cases people have actually been healed by this stuff, and you hear about it very occasionally. But the problem is this: so not a single human being has benefited from embryonic stem cell research. Why? They have not been able to get it out of animal trials because it causes tumors and it causes causes cancer, among other things. Right? They have never applied embryonic stem cell to humans. But you don't know that because whenever they talk about it, all the cases that they're talking about are adult stem cell, which is not a moral problem. So there's a massive confusion going on.
It's a bait and switch.
That is, bait and switch. It's total bait and switch. And the problem is that adult stem cell research is, you guys, that one I would almost say it is a conspiracy of silence, because I've actually talked to people. Guy who had multiple sclerosis, healed, would not let him tell anybody about it. Gee, I wonder why. Because there's a form of healing that could heal them and get it done with, and the Multiple Sclerosis Society wouldn't be needed. You know? And that's not the only one.
We've got about 3 major issues here that are really integrating themselves together, and it intrigues me how they kind of go 2 ways. You've got the issue of abortion, pro-life versus pro-choice, which then leads into the argument that it's good to be pro-choice because then you can use these embryos for stem cell research or embryonic stem cell research, which then could then, to link back, create kind of a wholesale market of paying women to have abortions just so that you can use the embryos. And then you go from stem cells, which is confusing the terms of embryonic and adult stem cells, much like in creation and evolution, we just mix up our terms and don't really tell people all our definitions, which then leads into cloning of human life. So we've kind of got these 3 issues.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And then cloning comes in this. Behind it all is cloning. Why? Because cloning is the means whereby they can get more millions and millions of human embryos. Right now, human cloning is technically illegal, but here there's all kinds of language manipulation going on there too, but anyway.
Would there be a push then for the pro-choice argument to try to push it towards that?
Yes.
Start at the basic level and work your way up?
Yes, and here's what they're doing. Right now, they can only use fertilized eggs out of in vitro clinics. Well, there's not enough of those. They need more to do more research, blah, 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 right? Cloning is this. When you clone, you take a unfertilized egg, and an unfertilized egg has a nucleus. When the sperm connects with it, the sperm nucleus connects and creates a new nucleus, and that's the human life, right? Well, you take an unfertilized egg, take out the nucleus. Then you take an actual human cell, just a normal adult human cell. You can get it out of your nose, you can get it out of your muscle, it doesn't matter. You take the nucleus out of that cell, which is a full human nucleus, right? You put it into an egg, and that becomes a live human embryo. Now, to do that in order to have babies is illegal. But what they're trying to do is to do that in order to get research. And what they're doing is, that's called somatic cell nuclear transfer, which is SCNT. Now that SCNT procedure is creating a human live embryo. But they are saying, the scientists and the legislators who are trying to lie to people, they're saying it's not. They're denying that it's, because what they're saying is, no, they're just creating cells that we're going to go to research. Now, if we wanted it to go implanted into a woman's womb, then that would be cloning. Now they're even denying that it's cloning, in other words. They're saying SCNT isn't really cloning because it's just for research. Or they'll call it therapeutic cloning versus reproductive cloning. Reproductive cloning is wrong because that's trying to create a human being, which creates monsters and all this stuff. But if we're doing it for therapeutic cloning, it's not really cloning a human being life. It's not cloning human life. It's just creating human cells. And I've got doctors and scientists saying this. They're denying the factual reality that it's so. Cloning does create human life. So if you are pro-life, you must be against cloning because cloning is creating human embryos and then they're killing them. Now again, I'm not making that judgment in the documentary. I'm just trying to point out that they're lying, that's all. You could be pro-life or pro-choice, and it doesn't matter. If you're watching this, it's like, look, these people are lying about science, lying about the definitions, right? And, of course, I do have a pro-life viewpoint. I won't deny that, but I minimize the pro-life argument in this documentary because we've been making that for years, and I'm not as interested in that as I am in, folks, if you're going to make an informed decision, they're not telling you the truth about things. And here's some truth, and then make your decision. I'm okay, with. So I don't try to make the argument, the pro-life argument. I just try to show what because there's many other issues. There's the issue of women's health. In order to procure all these women's eggs, they have to go through infertility drugs. Fertility drugs have not been properly analyzed, and women are getting cancer, and it's not being taken care of, and women are being exploited in this process. Mm-hmm. So there's the issue of women's health and the trafficking in women in eggs, turning women into egg factories to get their eggs, and then once they give all these eggs out, and they don't realize when they want to have their own child, their eggs are gone because they only have a finite amount of eggs. So there's all kinds of exploitation going on here. It's just a massive machine of deception. And my goal was I didn't even realize this. As I started researching it and interviewing people, all this stuff came to the foreground. So we try to fairly put it out there and show you, here's what's going on, and here's the misinformation. Make your own decision about your moral matters, but the fact is, this is human life, so you can't deny that. So you can argue away, but you can't deny it. So
yeah. Well, we've got to take another quick break, but before we go, do you want to share where we could be able to find this, or how we can keep up on the information of when this might be out and where we might be able to catch it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, if anyone's interested, I can put you on my email list, which I keep updated about movies that are important to me or things I'm involved in, which is not very often. But if they want to, email me, Brian@Godawa.com, it's very simple. I can put you on the email list. Also, you can just periodically check Godawa.com, because if a movie ever comes out, I'll point it out there, or if it's in production, I'll talk about it a little bit, so people can keep abreast of that from my website.
Well, we're here talking with Brian Godawa about films touching on church, state, stem cells, and academic inquiry, and we'll be right back to discuss the third and final documentary on the academic freedom. We'll be right back after this. What do you think it means to be worldly?
Usually in the Christian context, where you hear that sort of in Christianese speak, I think of it as being someone who looks at the world through eyes, or through some sort of lens that doesn't reflect the story or the narrative of Christianity. A worldly perspective is one that really fails to see redemption in the world.
I would think that the word worldly would mean just like it sounds, of the world, and basing your feelings on the way non-Christians think, and not looking to Christ as the basis of your answers and your motives of living your life.
I think of things that are more carnal than spiritual in nature.
I think of things that will pass away, things that are here on earth and will not remain beyond this earth.
I think it means us being apart from God. In the most basic form, I feel it's not including Him in our lives.
What does it mean to be in the world but not of it?
I would think that you're living your life in the world and going about your everyday, but your mindset is still Christ-minded. You still put yourself among non-believers as a way of a mission field in your everyday life.
The phrase "in the world but not of it" to me means that I have to live here in the spirit, in the physical, but I don't have to partake of these worldly distractions. That I have to be here, I have to make a living, I have to take care of my family and associate with people, but I don't have to partake of these other things.
When I think of the phrase "in the world but not of it," I've often been really confused. I'm not really sure exactly what that looks like, because it doesn't necessarily give you a practical roadmap just in the phrase in and of itself. But maybe it's an end that Christians can shoot for, that you attempt to somehow be connected with the unredeemed, or I guess worldly parts of this world, and yet stand firm for redeemed creation, for the life that Christ offers us in spite of that.
Ceasefire Strategies presents audio programming that encourages interaction with the world and engages issues of culture through two-way dialogue. Check out Cultural Diplomacy and other earthly programming each week only at www.ceasefirestrategies.net. Ceasefire Strategies. We don't just critique culture, we consume it.
And once again, we're joined by Brian Godawa to talk about his latest documentary, Schools Out, Academic Freedom versus Political Correctness. The premise is diversity in higher education has been defined in terms of race, gender, and class. Critics say this has resulted in a new tyranny of anti-Western prejudice. They claim education has turned into indoctrination of political ideology that undermines the university's goal of intellectual diversity and freedom. Supporters say this is a triumph over white European patriarchy that has unfairly dominated and distorted education with a Western prejudice. They reveal an underlying systemic structure of oppression against against minorities and traditional definitions of knowledge. Who is right? Who is wrong? Where does the truth lie? Or is the truth a social construct created in the interest of the ruling class? Godawa explores the battlefield of this raging war of cultural beliefs and educational standards going on in Ivy League citadels like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, but also in state schools all around the country. Go ahead and give us a little bit of the background on this one and maybe some of the things that you encountered in dealing with this topic of freedom versus political correctness.
Well, in one sense, the issue of political correctness nowadays seems like an old story. You know, political correctness. Yeah, that was in the 90s. You know, and the issues started in the 90s. But ironically, it's an old issue, and people don't know about it anymore because it's become the establishment at many American universities and colleges, and so people don't know about it, don't hear about it because it's the accepted form. And basically, what's happening is, in the name of diversity, you know, universities are employing racial diversity, you know, cultural diversity, but intellectual diversity, it seems, is not getting the same amount of support. And so what's happening is you've got race, gender, and class, but you don't have diversity of beliefs, a diversity of viewpoints. And, you know, basically, you know, multiculturalism is supposed to be about a diversity of viewpoints, but it's one viewpoint that's dominating the university in mostly in the humanities and social sciences, right? I mean, this may not be as much the case in science or you know, hard sciences or something, but certainly in the humanities and social sciences, what's happening is that diversity, the university was created in order to be a focal point of debate, discussion, and questioning of all ideas, of all orthodoxies, right? But now it has become its own orthodoxy that you cannot question. So if you don't think multiculturally, if you don't think in terms of tribal viewpoints of race, gender, and class, if you are of a liberal mindset, classical liberalism, or you're a Christian, or you are a Western in your viewpoint, then you are actually marginalized and repressed. And which is sort of an irony because multiculturalism is supposed to be about the freedom of oppression, but it's actually creating oppression in that it's squelching a lot of viewpoints. And so what happens is you've got everything from professors to students who are experiencing this this McCarthy-like tactics of repressing their beliefs. So we went around the country and interviewed a bunch of students and a bunch of professors to find out about this and, you know, what their experiences are. Got lots of students talking about their experiences in classes, and politics is one of the dominant problems. Political ideology is coming into a lot of classrooms, and so you've got, you know, I've got cases where you've got in an entomology class, a science class on bugs, you've got a professor, you know, showing them Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. In other classes, you know, like English classes or something, you'll have professors coming in and preaching hatred against George Bush and how you should vote for this candidate or that candidate. He could love George Bush. The problem is they're using their platform in classes like English and science and such to preach their politics to the students. And the students then feel a I forgot what's the name of that legal term where you feel like if you don't go along with your boss,
coercion.
You might lose your job. Yeah, it's basically implied coercion. So you've got students feeling that, if I don't support, you know, these political viewpoints, then my grade is not going to be good. So they spit out the things that they're telling them. So this is not education, you know. And there's a lot of these professors around the country who are feeling this oppression if they don't think the same way, and a lot of students. And because as we interviewed them, this is what we found out. And it's gotten to the point where there was even a movement called the Student Movement for Academic Freedom because they feel a lot of these conservative students feel oppressed. And basically what it comes down to is conservatives and Christians and Republicans, that whole sort of side, that's the side that's being repressed and oppressed in universities. And you know what? It would be just as wrong if it were left-wing liberals and Democrats who were being oppressed. Because the point is the university is not a place for political power and control. It should be questioning of all ideas. When you go to an ethics class or when you go to an economics class, You should have a professor who will honestly tell you all the various views of theories of economics, and allow you to engage with those views and to debate them back and forth. But what's turning out is there's too many examples of professors who teach economics from a Marxist viewpoint. So they're teaching about capitalism and all these various economic viewpoints, and it's all criticism. There's no fair depiction of these multiple viewpoints, and so they're allowing a political Marxism to dominate their education. So they're indoctrinating kids in their Marxist viewpoint rather than trying to provide the information and the knowledge, as fairly as possible. So that was kind of the problem that's going on in a lot of college campuses, and we try to document some of that what's going on. And there's been studies by UCLA and other sources that are not conservative that show that an overwhelming amount of professors, we're talking sometimes as high as 17-1 in sociology departments, sometimes as low as 5 or 6-1 of Democrats to Republicans, or 5-1 of liberals to conservatives in these various social sciences and humanities departments. And so you've got an imbalance in the viewpoint, which is interesting because multiculturalism says that if the outcome, if you don't have as many blacks as the percentage of society, then you're being racist. But in terms of viewpoints, they do not represent the major amount of viewpoints in America in the university. So by their own definition, universities are being basically viewpoint discrimination. They're discriminate, and they're being prejudiced and bigots, and they're not allowing many viewpoints to be taught. Now, again, this is not across the whole university. There are pockets of good examples, and there obviously are very many good teachers, and not all departments have this problem, but it is an increasing problem around the country.
How long ago did you write the script for this film?
Well, unfortunately, we've been working on the documentary for that one for a couple years. We've had a lot of problems getting it completed, a lot of technical, personal, and stuff like that, issues that we haven't been able to get it completed in time, and I'm kind of disappointed about that, but we just got to do the best we can. We like to get it done within the next 6 months, but, a lot of it depends on money that we need to get, and a lot of it depends on certain other things that need to fall into place.
Well, the reason I had asked that question was I was wondering if there might have been any influence on Ben Stein's latest film, Expelled, integrating that into this documentary.
Ben Stein's movie on Expelled is a highly focalized version of what I'm covering in my documentary. Yeah. That's specifically in science departments, and that's bigotry and suppression of multiple viewpoints of intelligent design scientists. That's just in science departments. Mine has to do with more broad, political viewpoints, conservative general, conservative liberal, that kind of a thing, rather than just intelligent design and evolution. But yeah, what they talk about in that film is very similar to what we're talking about. In fact, we have some of the same metaphors in my film, Big Brother and stuff like that they have in theirs, but they got their movie out sooner, so.
Well, in all three of these documentaries that we've been talking about, it sure sounds like there's kind of an awful lot of fighting going on in our country on not just these three issues, but overall. And looking at the title of the web page for the summary that contains the summary for Schools Out was entitled Campus Culture Wars. And I think of two documentaries that are pretty prevalent right now, Purple State of Mind by Craig Detweiler and John Marks, and the recent Lord Save Us from Your Followers with Dan Merchant, which both explore the issue of ending the cultural war and learning how to find common ground and bridge that gap. Do you see that the culture wars between your documentaries and these issues, do you see the culture wars going away anytime soon? Do you see certain strategies that are being implemented in society that's bringing a resolution, or are we just as divisive as ever?
Well, that's a good question. I do think that sort of like just apply the principles of pluralism that you apply everywhere else, apply them in these situations, and things would be okay. Everyone talks about pluralism and multiple viewpoints, but for some reason they don't apply them when it comes to these issues. And really, the answer is just simple as that. You just have to learn to be able to agree to disagree, and you're going to have to learn to be able to tolerate other viewpoints, yet still be able to argue with them. But I do see an increase in this country. I have seen an increase of the chasm between the two, and a certain, and even in this current election cycle, it seems to be an increase in hatred, literally hatred and bile in people. They can't just argue and disagree. They have to actually hate and key cars with bumper stickers that they don't agree with, and this kind of a thing where it's this violent reaction by people who can't believe that other people can believe differently than them. That's a real problem, I think. My goal in my documentaries was just to address the issue, and we do address a little bit about, well, what is academic freedom and how can we get there, My goal is not to say, well, how I want to make this documentary to bring a solution. My goal is to analyze and see what's the truth and what don't we know about it, and once we learn about it, then to hint or point towards a direction. As people on an individual level face their own evil, their own sin, their own, hatreds or whatever, their own inability to get along with people. And as we do that, we model that behavior to others. And as others see it, hopefully, they will be convicted of their own hostility towards others and learn how to get along with while disagreeing. Otherwise, there's no hope, because you can't do it top down. You can't enforce it upon people. People have to be redeemed from the inside out. So you're not going to save society with it doesn't matter who wins this political cycle, right or left, Republican or Democrat. That's not going to save society. People have to change from the inside out, and that's how grace is ultimately experienced. And so I think, the answer is becoming gracious and redemptive in your own life as a model for others. But that doesn't mean you don't address the truth. The prophets in the Old Testament sometimes had to rail against the immoralities that were going on. So sometimes there's a place for railing against immoralities in certain fights that are valuable to go ahead and be hostile about in the right spirit, But just hatred for the sake of hatred because someone has a different political viewpoint than you is terribly, terribly wrong. And I've experienced that from people. That just shocks me. Even Christians who disagree with me politically, and the hatred that they express towards me, I can't understand it. I mean, I'm like, how could you, the Bible says that if you claim to love God but you hate your brother, how can the love of God abide in you? And so while I disagree heartily with someone, I wouldn't want to hate them because they believe in some other political leader that I don't or something. I wouldn't key their car. What's that? What's that about? That's the scary proposition, that the hearts of individuals are not redemptive, and so society's not going to be redemptive until they are.
Well, we want to thank you for having joined us today, Brian. We're going to go ahead and take another break, and then Tim and I will be back to kind of share some of our thoughts about today, kind of summarize it up, and talk a little bit more about this importance of documentaries. We've been talking with Brian Godawa, and we'll be right back after this.
If you're making an independent film, short or feature length, contact Runaway Pen Productions today. We have experience in writing, producing, directing, and editing short films with International Film Festival play and sales representation. We also have worked on feature films in various crew capacities. Visit us on the web at runawaypen.webs.com. That's runawaypen.webs.com. Runaway Pen Productions is independent digital filmmaking where story comes first.
Welcome back to Cultural Diplomacy. Let me just ask you, Tim, what did you think about today?
I thought it was very informative. I think that Brian brings up some very good points about, first of all, documentary films and our responses to them and how we ought to, as Christians, view them and endeavor to make them. I think that one of the big points that I'd like to make is that we do have an obligation to be informed, especially as this election nears and we're going to go to the ballot box and make our decisions on who leads our country. We really need to be the ones to do the research on where the candidates stand on the various issues and not so much go in there thinking, I'm going to vote for so-and-so because I agree with him on one or two issues, but make sure that we agree with them on all the issues and make sure that if there is something we're opposed to in our government, we write the people and call the people that are responsible for making those laws and let them know that we'd like those things to change.
Well, I mean, it seems it would be rather difficult, though, to find, I guess, what we would call our quote-unquote perfect candidate. Because certainly none of the candidates are going to align, with everything you believe on certain issues. And, I mean, the issues we've been discussing today, I guess the question would be, does America overall, the citizens in our country, see these as the most important issues? Some of these issues will probably take more of a back seat. I mean, obviously, when we talk about the wall of separation, or that separation church and state, where we fall on that line, or on that side of that issue, will determine how we vote. Well, really, all of those do, but I mean, if we believe that religion has no place in our society, then we're not going to listen to any candidate or anyone that has a religious point of view.
Mm-hmm. I think that while we're never going to find that perfect candidate, it's also important to keep in mind what the candidates we vote for have power to decide. In other words, if you may be pro-life, there may be no candidates on the ballot for school board who are pro-life, but they don't have the authority to legislate pro-choice measures. So is that really, a position where we would say, oh, I don't want to vote for that guy because he's pro-choice? But overall, we have to be informed about what we're voting for.
Very true. I actually thought it was quite interesting on the stem cell documentary that really the basis or root of this issue seems to start with abortion. And stem cells seem to be more of the intermediary between the basis and the ultimate goal of cloning. But I found it rather interesting that all three of those issues are rather linked politically, that we're starting at abortion and we're just really trying to persuade people over to that ultimate end of cloning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was also interesting how he mentioned that most of the pro-embryonic stem cell people say that life begins at 14 days, and so they're not causing an end to life, but then those same people would also be pro-abortion. So which is it? Does life begin at 14 days, or does it begin after the child exits the womb?
I have talked with a few pro-choice people who certainly don't, I mean, they're not necessarily pro-abortion, but, I mean, because they would say, at a certain point, they would definitely have a problem. I know some people that are pro-choice would maybe draw that line at like that, into that second trimester or, so many weeks in. So I guess there are some that wouldn't, say that all abortion is okay. But you certainly do have some that would be more that pro-abortion. It's so easy to draw the lines between, here's pro-life and here's pro-choice. You either fall into one or you fall into the other. And that gets to be kind of a sticky situation when you start to get into some of the more complex issues about where you stand on the question of when does life begin. Is that ultimately a moral question? Is it a medical question? And like I, stated in that section of our show, that I'd heard a lecture by a biology professor of a religious college, that had stated, had put that life beginning, life, began at conception in the sense that you've got the joining of two, the sperm and the egg, but in the sense of it becoming a unique life was at that second somatic transfer, which was about 36 to 48 hours in. That's certainly a far cry from 14 days in, 2 weeks. You're talking a 12-day difference.
Yeah.
So, and then that begs the question, well, then when you get into the morning after pill, is that really abortion if it's, basically aborting the pregnancy as opposed to aborting the fetus when you're getting it in there in that first 36 hours? So, I guess that's a tough issue, too, because, there are different denominations that certainly put that question. And there's a lot of churches that just say, our position is life begins at conception. They don't necessarily have a specific written position, such as the Catholic Church has it very clearly written out, what they do and don't believe. But I guess I do wonder medically, even if we do say life begins at 36 hours in, is that really enough time to say it makes any difference?
Ultimately, the issue with pro-life versus pro-choice comes down to a matter of respecting life in all of its stages, from before conception until natural death. And the debate goes on about stem cells, and the debate is also raging about euthanasia, about assisted suicide, And when we get into these issues of where does life begin and where does life end, are we determining, are we determining ourselves to be God and the ones who make that decision? And I think that we really need to leave that decision to Him. He knows when life begins. Whether we medically say, 48 hours or 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever, He knows when that life was scheduled to begin, and He knows when it was scheduled to end. And we don't have the right to determine that. Now obviously He has given us dominion, and we have taken that role. But when we think about pro-life issues, we have to think about really respecting life.
And I like your definition of pro-life, that pro-life isn't adherent strictly to the issue of abortion. Pro-life is a issue that encompasses all of life from cradle to grave. It also not only touches on issues like euthanasia and assisted suicide, but it also touches on issues like capital punishment. And there's certainly differing perspectives between Catholic and Protestant on the issue of capital punishment, just as there is on the issues of contraceptions and birth control. But I like that definition of pro-life because it encompasses everything. It doesn't just pigeonhole things into specific issues, that much like we integrate our faith into all areas, whether it's your religious or Christian belief in film, Christian belief in politics, Christian belief in biology or zoology. The same is true of politics, that when we look at these issues, we don't see each issue as isolated. Abortion affects stem cell research. Stem cell research affects cloning, as we discovered in that section. So when we vote on issues of homosexual marriage, that also ties in then to health benefits and other taxation issues. So it's each of these issues are not completely isolated to the point where I say, well, I'm voting for this candidate because they take this stance on this one issue. Because then we start to see these things as isolated, and we don't really then take the mental thought to see how it fits into all these other issues. So that's why I like that definition of pro-life, is because it really integrates, or tries to integrate everything together, instead of saying this is one way, this is another, and so on down the political menu for issues.
Yeah.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes left. Certainly an interesting discussion today. I kind of like this format of kind of doing our own little summary there after our interviews. Gives us a chance to talk about where we stand on things, and gives you, our listeners, a chance to get another perspective, if you will, as well as the different perspectives between Tim and myself. I'm of that Protestant background, and Tim has that Protestant background but has converted to Catholicism. So we don't just preach the idea of dialoguing between people of differing beliefs. We live it amongst ourselves, and we try to live that example, that even though we differ on some things, and at times we're diametrically opposed, we can still peacefully sit down and have that discussion among ourselves without fighting it out or saying, well, you're wrong and you're not part of us, so I'm just going to ignore you and not listen to you.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank everybody for listening today. A couple, websites to mention is www.godawa.com. That is Brian's personal webpage, has information on all these documentaries, as well as some of his other projects. For Wall of Separation, don't forget there's also the other title, Faith of Our Fathers, with that website, wallofseparation.net. I would also recommend, actually, for that Wall of Separation documentary, checking out the book entitled The Faiths of the Founding Fathers by David L. Holmes. That's a hardcover book published back in 2006, and is available through Amazon.com, and we'll go ahead and put that on our store as well. For the documentary of the stem cell research, that one, there's so much out there. I don't know really what one specific thing to give as a good resource for that, but certainly pick up medical journals and things along that nature, and kind of get an understanding of what it is because in order to take a moral stance on an issue, you have to first understand what that issue is. And then on the final documentary, School's Out, when that comes out, if you get the chance to see that, I would also see Ben Stein's documentary, Expelled, and touching on the issues of the culture wars. I would also recommend Purple State of Mind by Craig Detweiler and John Marks, and Lord Save Us from Your Followers with Dan Merchant. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you back here next week. Take care, everyone.
Have a great week.
Cultural Diplomacy is a production of Ceasefire Strategies, a ministry seeking to bridge the gap between Christians and culture. Visit us online at www.ceasefirestrategies.com. To discuss the show or learn more about today's guest, check out the CFS forums at www.ceasefirestrategies.net. Acte est fabula pladite.